Okay, folks, I can see we just hit 1 minute after the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Matt Thomas, and thank you for tuning in to the USGS Landslide Hazards Seminar. This meeting is hosted by the Landslide Hazards Program and co-organized with contributions from Stephen Slaughter and Jamie Kostelnik. For those of you that are new to this meeting, you have the ability to submit questions via the chat window or to use the raise your hand feature in combination with your microphone or video camera. We're going to wait until the end of today's presentation to take questions. So in the meantime, please just do your best to make sure that your microphone is off or muted and your video camera is off when you're not intending to speak. It's my pleasure today to introduce Xuxuan Li, who is currently a postdoc at UCLA working with Professor Peltzer and Moon on a permafrost project in Tibet using INSAR and hydrologic modeling. She received her PhD in Earth and Planetary Sciences from Northwestern University in June 2024 and her master's in climate science from UNC Chapel Hill in 2020. I'm happy to have her here today. Xuxuan, I'm going to go ahead and let you start your presentation.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you everyone for coming. Today I'll be talking about use of WRF-Hydro to identify landslide-susceptible areas at regional scales. So the work I'll be presenting today mainly based on my PhD work. I did that at Northwestern University with Dr. Daniel Horton. And on these projects, there are also a whole bunch of other awesome collaborators. I would like to thank them and also thank to the founding agency, NSF, for supporting the research I'll be presenting today. So before I get started, I would like to give you a little bit more background on where I come from and how I ended up in this field. So as Matt introduced, I got my master's in climate science from UNC Chapel Hill. So here are two publications I got out of the work there. They are mainly focused on climate variability and predictability of atmospheric rivers over the North Atlantic using climate simulations. So from these trainings, I cultivate a large-scale perspective in my work. I mainly focused on the relationship between climate and meteorology. But during my master's studies, I stopped there. I never thought about what will happen after these atmospheric rivers make landfall, until I read some news and also some papers saying that atmospheric rivers are dominant synaptic weather systems for triggering landslides in Western United States. And one atmospheric river can trigger hundreds or even thousands of landslides. That has totally blown up my mind and has really motivated me to continue along this cascading hazard chain and to employ hydrologic models to connect from climate to meteorology to hydrology and all the way down to land surface hazards. So when I started my PhD projects, I immediately realized that we're standing on the shoulders of the giants. We know very well about the two mechanisms that trigger rainfall triggered landslides. And they are the infiltration-induced landslides. So following a precipitation, the infiltration could increase, groundwater table rises, and shear strength decreases, and the failure occurred. Whereas in another type of mechanism, the rapid and large runoff is usually the dominant driver. As you can see from this animation, following rainfall, there is a buildup in the runoff, and more sediment was entrained and transported, and a clear water flood turns into a muddy flow. And this type of mechanism is very common in post-fire burn areas. And I will talk about that in a little bit. So in both these mechanisms, hydrology is dominant driver. And the current process-based techniques to predict landslides using these two mechanisms mainly focus on individual catchments or slopes. So for infiltration-induced landslides, usually a hydrology model is coupled to a geotechnical model to simulate the force balance on the slope. For runoff-generated models, usually a rainfall runoff model coupled to a sediment erosion and transport model is used to simulate the triggering point for a debris flow. So these models work well at individual catchments or slope scales. However, these meteorological events that trigger landslides are usually big in scale. Take Hurricane Maria as an example. It hit Puerto Rico in 2017 and triggered hundreds to thousands of landslides in the island. And also, we've seen many of these examples in California. For example, the past winter and this winter, we all saw atmospheric rivers triggered hundreds to even thousands of landslides across the entire state. So at these large scales, there's less consensus across landslide prediction techniques. The most widely adopted method right now in the early warning systems for landslides is rainfall intensity duration thresholds. It's like a linear line that distinguishes the triggering versus non-triggering rainfall intensity and duration values. And some other people also have been advocating in recent decades that we should incorporate hydrologic information into these rainfall ID thresholds to construct hydrometeorological thresholds. And these hydrometeorological thresholds also have been found to outperform the purely rainfall ID thresholds. But these data-driven methods have come across some substantial challenges because the atmospheric rivers or the other meteorological events, they operate at such a large scale. On the ground, it's usually very heterogeneous in the ground conditions. Take the Western United States as an example. There will be wildfire burn scars. There will be snow cover, soil ice, and also different antecedent conditions from the previous storms that are encapsulated in the footprints of atmospheric rivers or a tropical storm. So in these cases, regional scale tools that consider all of these heterogeneities are required to resolve AR's impacts on land surface hazards. So for my PhD, I start to think that why not use hydrologic models to identify landslide susceptible conditions, because there are several obvious advantages associated with regional scale hydrologic models. First is that they couple the atmospheric and land surface processes. And second, they resolve the comprehensive terrestrial water cycle. So they resolve starting from precipitation. It simulates the partition between infiltration and runoff generation, and also snow melt, soil ice, thawing, land surface runoff processes, and also subsurface flow, and lake processes, and also evapotranspiration, and all the way back to the atmosphere. And thirdly, it's physics-based, so it follows physical rules. So when compared to purely data-driven models, they are more adaptable for different climate scenarios, especially in an ever-changing climate. The model I used for my PhD is WRF-Hydro, Weather Research and Forecasting Hydrological Modeling System. It's a community model. That means everybody can contribute to the code. And it's a regional scale, it's physics-based and spatially distributed. In the below, I will walk you through the components of it and also the workflow of it. So it starts from using a precipitation data set to drive the model. The model consists of non-MP land surface model, which is relatively coarse in spatial resolution. It's usually on the order of kilometers, but it simulates the comprehensive energy fluxes and moisture fluxes that happens at the interface between atmosphere and land. It includes like runoff, soil moisture, evapotranspiration, snow melt, soil ice, and also the interflow, also the flow into the groundwater. And then this is two-way coupled to a terrain routing module that simulates subsurface flow and overland flow at a relatively higher spatial resolution. It's typically 30 to 300 meters. And this is in turn coupled to a streamflow routing module that simulates channelized streamflow at the same resolution. There is also a groundwater bucket model that's coupled to these two modules that simulates groundwater inflow and outflow. So this is just a simplified schematic of WRF-Hydro. It's actually a very sophisticated hydrologic model, and it runs on supercomputers. Another important fact about WRF-Hydro is that it's the hydrologic core for NOAA's national water model for the contiguous US. So it predicts streamflow at about 2.7 million river reaches 24/7. So it's already in operational use. And because of that, WRF-Hydro has the unique advantage that it works at a scale that's commensurate with modern weather forecasts. And so that means if any developments and any augmentation that we made to WRF-Hydro has the potential to be pushed into operational use. So, okay, that's like a brief introduction on the background and the model I use. For my PhD, I use this model to study landslide susceptibility and understand landslide susceptibility at the regional scales in 3 projects. And in the below, I will walk you through the 3 projects. And in the end, I will quickly recap and talk about some of my thoughts on the future directions. So the first project is a published paper in Water Resources Research. This is entitled Toward Improved Regional Hydrological Model Performance Using State-of-the-Science Data-Informed Soil Parameters. This is more of a methodological paper in which we utilize open access soil databases to inform our parameter setting in WRF-Hydro so as to improve the soil moisture and streamflow simulations in the model. So we care about this because soil moisture and streamflow are both critical variables for landslide susceptibility assessment or prediction. However, the field observations of them are pretty sparse in space, especially soil moisture. So here I'm showing you the in-situ soil moisture observations are pretty sparse in space, especially in complex terrains. And remote sensing tries to fill that data gap by providing near global coverage. However, remote sensing only retrieves the skin soil moisture. So it doesn't go down deeper into the soil. And also because remote sensing is usually based on a measurement of temperature and back calculate the moisture. So it suffers from biases, especially in heavily vegetated areas or urban areas or complex terrains. A third type of soil moisture data set is the simulations by land surface models. Land surface models provide continuous spatially distributed soil moisture data at regional to global scales. And it also goes down deeper to the root zone. However, they are usually at relatively coarse spatial resolution, and also a benchmarking of these models are still missing. So for specific applications, when we try to simulate soil moisture, we usually build our own hydrologic models and calibrated and validated to simulate soil moisture at high resolution. So for this project, I used WRF-Hydro to simulate high resolution soil moisture for a study area in the coastal ranges of California. Here's how I set up the model. Again, this is like a simplified schematic. For the precipitation forcing, I use the MRMS precipitation. It's multi-radar, multi-sensor precipitation. It's a radar-based observation. It's graded at 1 kilometer and hourly temporal resolution. And I output soil moisture and streamflow at 100 meter and hourly temporal resolution, and use that to, conducted several sensitivity experiments and to see how the parameters will influence the ultimate soil moisture simulations. And for this project, I focused on a complex terrain in the central California coast. So here's a map of my study area, and we're right at the Pacific coast. The black box here outline my model domain. Within my model domain, there are 7 in-situ soil moisture stations, and they are marked by the blue markers. And the purple crosses are the 9 USGS stream gauges. Within my model domain, there's a high gradient of topographic changes. So there's really flat areas. There's also really steep slopes. We run our model with all the default parameters for this model domain. And then we found that the default simulation does not perform well in this area when we compare it to the in-situ observations. And the typical approach to deal with this in the current literature is people will iteratively calibrate the model, like soil moisture and streamflow related parameters until it reaches an optimal performance. However, this approach would be very expensive for our application. Take one run as an example. It takes about 40,000 core hours to run 1 year of simulations. So if you want to calibrate it iteratively, for example, 100 runs, that would be very, very expensive. Besides, there's also a potential overfitting issue if you extensively calibrate the parameters. So to avoid these two issues, we start to look into the problem and try to identify what goes wrong. And we found that the default soil parameters are pretty off when we compare it with some other better estimates that are based on observations. And take porosity as an example. Here in the map, I'm showing the default porosity used by WRF-Hydro. It uses a StatsGo Cosby configuration. These are two data sets. The StatsGo is a 1 kilometer soil type map that provides a map of 16 soil types. And Cosby et al. 1984 is a soil analysis paper that is based on lab experiments, and it provides soil properties as a function of soil type in a lookup table. So if you combine these two data sets, you'll get a map of soil properties. And this is the porosity for my model domain. As you can see, for complex terrain like this, there's not much of a spatial variation in the porosity. When we consult another data set that's called Polaris, it's probability mapping of Essergo. It's done by Cheney et al. 2016. Essergo is an observation-based soil survey database for soil parameters. And the Polaris is a machine learning version of that, and it deals with several issues in Essergo, like the data gaps or the political boundaries. So Polaris is regarded to be more up-to-date with finer resolution and finer details. And when you compare these two maps, you can clearly identify that there is more spatial heterogeneity in the Polaris dataset. So Polaris is closer to reality. And then another evidence that shows that the default parameters in WRF-Hydro might be off is in the soil thickness. We found that the default soil thickness is 2 meters everywhere. However, the Essergo indicates that a domain average for our model is 40 centimeters. So that's less than half of the default value. And that has, profound implications on the streamflow simulations and also soil water storage. And I'll show that in just a little bit. So now our problem turns out into how can we utilize this open access soil databases, Essergo and Polaris, to improve WRF-Hydro's model performance. And we did that to following this schematic workflow here. On the left-hand side are the two soil databases we use, and we conducted two sensitivity experiments. The first is called Polaris 2 meter, and the second is Polaris 40 centimeter. In the first experiment, we utilized the median porosity, median saturated hydraulic conductivity, and clay fraction from Polaris to either replace or calculate the corresponding parameters in WRF-Hydro. That's our first sensitivity experiment. The second experiment, we keep everything else the same, but only change the soil thickness from 2 meter to 40 centimeter. And the 40 centimeter, as I said before, is based on the domain average depth to bedrock data from the Essergo. So with these two sensitivity experiments and a baseline with all the default parameters, we are able to assess how much improvement we got with the updated parameters. Before I show you the results, I would like to quickly show you how it looks like in WRF-Hydro for the soil moisture simulations. So here is 3 time snapshots of soil moisture. And on the left-hand side is before a storm. In the middle is during the peak of a storm. And on the right-hand side is after the storm passed. So the color here is the volumetric soil moisture. And the blue contour here is the 24-hour rainfall accumulation. As you can see, WRF-Hydro simulates the wetting and drying process when a storm passed by. If you zoom in into the black box here, you'll see in this inset map here, there's a lot of small features there. Those are the channels. So the model simulates the soil moisture to be wetter within the channels compared to their overland neighborhoods. And that's very realistic. So, okay, now I will show you how much improvement we got with these updated soil parameters. First, I will show you an example for soil moisture at a station Gilroy. Here is the time series for soil moisture. It's at hourly resolution over an 8-month period. The black line is the observation and the colored lines are the model simulations. The green bars here are the rain rate. As you can see, the model can capture the general variability pretty well, including diurnal and also seasonal variability. However, there's a systematic underestimate in the model simulations across the time period. And that's mainly due to the bias in the initial conditions right here. So updating the soil parameters does not fix the problems in the initial conditions. So we could not fix that, but we indeed see improvements in several quantitative metrics in the Polaris 2-meter sensitivity experiment compared to our baseline. So as you can see from the chart on the right-hand side, we see increased correlation coefficient, decreased root mean square error, and increased KGE number. KGE is a comprehensive evaluation metric for hydrologic models. So if it's greater, that means the model is performing better. So this is not only true at this station, but also true at the other 6 stations in my model domain. For streamflow, we saw a similar story. Here I'm showing one example at the USGS stream gauge. This is the hydrograph, and black is the observation, and the colored lines are the model simulations. We see the greatest improvements in the Polaris 40 centimeters sensitivity experiment. That is the red line here. You can see the red line can capture the first few peak flow events much better. So that means after we account for a more realistic soil thickness, we can capture the peak flow events and peak timing and also the magnitude much better than the baseline. And that's also manifested in the much improved KGE number here. So the KGE increased by almost 3-folds. And this is just one example, but I have more examples in the paper, and they all tell a similar story. So some key takeaways from this project. We used a non-iterative method with only open access soil databases. We're able to improve landslide-relevant hydrological variables like soil moisture and streamflow. And this is a performance that it's equivalent to some manual expert guided calibration. So using this simple methodology, we're able to yield these powerful results. So because of these powerful results, we advocate that a widely adoption of this method because it can account for the real world conditions better before you go into extensive calibration. And that can help save calibration effort and also computational cost. That's the first project. Now let's share gear a little bit and look at wildfires impacts for post-fire debris flow susceptibility, which is a big topic in California. This is also a published material in the journal Natural Hazards in Earth System Sciences. It's entitled Augmentation of WRF-Hydro to Simulate Overland Flow and Streamflow Generated Debris Flow Susceptibility and Burn Scars. So the reason why we think it's important to account for wildfires in our hydrologic model is because wildfires can exert really significant modifications to the soil properties and land cover to increase flooding and debris flow susceptibility. So in this two schematic, I'm showing the modifications done by wildfires. In a pre-fire scenario, you have a healthy forest. The canopy works well to intercept the water, and there's leaf litter on the ground, and also the soil can absorb water normally. So when it rains, the groundwater recharge and also the runoff, the infiltration are all normal. Whereas in the post-fire scenario, especially a severely burned one, the trees are gone, the canopies are gone, and there's a thick ash layer on the ground. The ash could block the soil pores, and severe burn could also induce hydrophobicity on the soil. And all of these combined will induce minimum absorption of water by the soil. When it rains, there's higher likely there will be excess runoff and sediment erosion and transport on steep slope, and that turns into a debris flow. California has all of these dangerous factors like steep topography, frequent wildfires, and frequent atmospheric rivers that dump precipitation. So all of these combined is a perfect recipe for post-fire debris flows. We have seen many times in history that California has experienced post-fire flooding and debris flows that destructed people's houses and infrastructure, and also claim some human lives. And in the past few decades, we've seen that California's wildfires are growing in size, in frequency, and also intensity. As you can see from these maps here, the year of 2020 is a big event. So the increasing size in the wildfires, plus the big scales of these landslide-triggering meteorological events like the atmospheric rivers, these two combined means we will see more and more post-fire debris flows occur in areas that have never seen them. So in these cases, process-based tools for assessing post-fire debris flow susceptibility at regional scales are critically needed, however, are still very limited. To try to address that gap, we use WRF-Hydro to look at a case study in January of 2021. So during this event, an atmospheric river made landfall to the central California coast and dumped precipitation over 300 millimeter in just 4 days. And most of the precipitation was dumped on wildfire burn scar from year 2020. That's the Dolan burn scar. So here the map is showing you the accumulated precipitation on top of some of the wildfire burn scars. So if we zoom in to look at Dolan burn scar, there are several key features here. There are 3 main tributaries for the Salina rivers. There are Arroyo Seco River, there are San Antonio River, and Nacimiento River. And also these 4 yellow triangles here indicate 4 post-fire debris flow observations. They were discovered because our colleague drove up the road and identified deposits intersected with major roads. And there may be more in these remote areas without any major roads, but we just don't have any observations for them. So at Rat Creek, which is right here, it has the highest consequence among the 4 observed post-fire debris flow events, because California Highway 1 was washed out into the ocean and it closed for over 3 months. However, when a team of people that when they investigated the site, they found that the collapse of Highway 1 might not be directly due to the post-fire debris flow event, but because of a failure in the human infrastructure. So the boulders from the debris flow block the drainage pipe, and the failure in the culvert has caused the collapse in Highway 1. So that's an important fact to keep in mind because there's no infrastructure in my model, so that's not possible for my model to simulate that. So here is how I set up the model in this project. I pretty much adopt the same methodology and configuration from my previous project. Again, I'm using the MRMS precipitation to drive the model. And there's also other meteorological variables that I didn't mention here. And for this project, I output overland flow and streamflow at 100 meter to assess post-fire debris flow susceptibility. But before we can do that, we need to account for wildfires impacts in the model because that does not exist in the off-the-shelf WRF-Hydro. To do that, I need to perform some parameter changes to replicate the burn scar effects. Coming back to this schematic here, to replicate the tree or the vegetation effects, I changed the land cover type to barren and sparsely vegetated within the burn parameters, and that will reduce the canopy height and overland flow roughness for the burn scars. And here are two maps showing the reduced parameters. As you can see, the values within the burn parameters are much reduced compared to the neighborhoods. And the second change I did is to replicate the soil sealing effects. I reduced the saturated hydraulic connectivity. And that's shown here in this map. So all of these three changes combined constitute my burn scar simulation. In contrast, I also have a simulation that's without any burn scars. And sometimes I also call it pre-fire scenario or the baseline scenario. So by comparing the baseline with the burn scar scenario, I'm able to assess the post-fire debris flow susceptibility due to fire. So here I'm showing the accumulated precipitation map again, because here I want to emphasize that the precipitation here is on the scales of hundreds of kilometers. And our model is able to provide assessment that match this AR's large spatial extent. In the middle is the peak discharge simulations from the model. As you can see that within and also downstream of the burn scars, there's elevated peak discharge. Many other studies use peak discharge as an indicator for post-fire debris flow susceptibility. In our paper, we modify it a little bit. We use the difference between the post-fire scenario and the pre-fire scenario in the peak discharge and normalize it by the catchment area. So to normalize it by catchment area, we're able to get rid of the influence from the catchment size on the peak discharge. And here is the result of that metric. Green means it's more susceptible to post-fire debris flows after the fire, whereas brown means it's less susceptible. As you can see, majority of the catchments within the burn parameter has elevated susceptibility, but there's also substantial spatial heterogeneity from catchments to catchments. And that's mainly controlled by mini topography and also the differences in precipitation, etc. At 3 of the 4 observed sites, which are highlighted by the orange circles here, our model simulate 3 of them have elevated susceptibility. And at Red Creek, our model says there's no change in susceptibility. This is mainly because Red Creek is really a tiny catchment, so the increases in the peak flow might not be as prominent as the other bigger catchments. And also, as I mentioned before, that at Red Creek, the collapse of Highway 1 was actually due to failure in the human infrastructure, which is not present in my model. So in the future, to more accurately account for this, the human infrastructure is needed to be accounted for. So in this map, you may also wonder what happens to all of these areas. They indicate, elevated susceptibility, but there is no observations to verify them. So to answer that, we consult remote sensing, and we found a general good agreement between remotely sensed and modeled susceptibility. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you the remote sensing results. This is extracted signal from Sentinel-2 data, and it's basically the normalized difference vegetation index. So the yellow patches in this map is showing catchments that contain vegetation loss signals after the event, and purple means no signal. On the right-hand side, I'm showing the model susceptibility as a comparison. As you can see, you can identify several broad similarities between these two maps. First, along the Arroyo-Seco River, our model picks up it to have elevated susceptibility, and the remote sensing indicates there is significant vegetation loss. Along the Nacimiento River, our model also picked up that, and along the San Antonio River, our model also picked up that. So this general good agreement between the two techniques gives us confidence that our model is able to capture the general susceptibility increase because of the fire and also because of the rainfall event. But there are caveats associated with this analysis. That is, neither of these techniques have sediment component in it. So they indicate susceptibility just based on vegetation loss in the remote sensing and only based on water flow and increase in peak discharge in the model. However, a combination of these two techniques can be really useful for guiding post-event field observations because people often don't know where to look at after an event. But using these large-scale applications of these techniques, we're able to narrow down some catchments to inspect. Some key takeaways from this project. We applied a community hydrologic model for the first time to predict post-fire debris flow susceptibility at regional scales. And secondly, we have demonstrated WRF-Hydro's ability to represent this cascading hazard chain from wildfire to meteorology to hydrology and all the way down to land surface hazards. But of course, there are insufficiencies and also things that needs to be improved in our modeling framework. With further developments, we can, better refine this methodology and apply it at larger scales. That's the second project, and now we are moving on to the third project. So from the previous two projects, I have validated the variables. I have account for wildfires, burn scar effects on hydrology. In this project, I sort of combine all of the methodologies from the previous two projects and here inspect the mixed hydrometeorological pathways at an even larger scale. So in this case, I'm looking at entire California. And this is work that's in progress. We literally just submitted it. In this project, we look at the impactful weather events during the winter time of last year. So during winter last year, at least 9 atmospheric rivers hit California in a row. And those are indicated by these blue arrows here in this map. And they literally just fall in every location along the coast of California. And these atmospheric rivers have induced record-breaking rainfall and snowfall in many parts of the California. And here I'm showing the estimated cumulative rainfall from the ARs. As you can see, the Coast Ranges and the Sierra Nevada mountains are places that receive the most precipitation. These ARs has triggered widespread flooding and landslide events. Among the landslides, there are also post-fire debris flows. And in the Sierra Nevada, we think there is snow and ice processes that are dominating some of the landslide generation as well. So it's going to be a very complicated, widespread event, and there will be different populations of landslide triggering mechanisms there. As an emergency response for the event, the CGS compiled about 700 landslides from multiple sources, and they reported the coordinates of the landslides and also the date. With the tools we developed from the previous two projects and also the CGS database, we try to address two research questions in this project. The first question is, how can regional hydrometeorology explain landslide susceptibility? And the second question is, what if there are different hydrological processes are contributing to the landslides in California? To answer these two questions, I adopted the same methodologies from the previous two projects, but only enlarged my model domain to the entire California. Again, I'm using the MRMS precipitation to drive the model and conducted a non-burn and a burn scenario. In the burn scenario, I validated the soil moisture, streamflow, and snow water equivalent simulations against in-situ observations across the state. After validated it, I used it to simulate a suite of hydrological variables like overland flow, streamflow, evapotranspiration, soil moisture, drainage to groundwater, snow water equivalent, etc., and use all of these hydrological variables to conduct a state-level water balance analysis. From the water balance analysis, we found a metric called positive water balance status has a good correspondence with the CGS landslide observations. So the WBS water balance status is defined following this equation here. It's basically the difference between precipitation, evapotranspiration, drainage from soil bottom, and the changes in storage terms, including the snow, soil, and canopy, and using that difference to divide it by the annual precipitation climatology. So if this term is positive, that means there's excess water because precipitation exceeds the rest of the terms. So there will be higher susceptibility for that grid cell. If it's negative, that means precipitation is not enough to exceed the rest of the terms. There's only limited water, and that corresponds with lower susceptibility. I will illustrate how this works in two examples. One is a weaker AR with fewer precipitation accumulation, and the other one is a stronger AR with more precipitation and also more landslides reported. First, let's look at the weaker one. The map here is showing the WBS in the map. The red is the positive, that means excess water. Blue means negative, limited water. There are only 3 landslides reported for this AR. On the left-hand side, I'm plotting the values, the WBS values at these 3 landslide locations. And all of the 3 landslides are located in areas with positive WBS. In another example, which is the stronger one, there are 350 landslides triggered by this AR, and they are marked by these black circles. Again, 94% of these 350 landslides are located in areas with simulated positive water balance status. As you can see, there's also a lot of areas with red, but without any landslide observations. This is due to 2 major reasons. The first is that our model is not perfect. There might be biases in it because we only consider the hydrological conditions. And the second reason is also important to note is that the CGS data set might not be comprehensive, might not be exhaustive, because they compiled compiled from many sources, and the major source is public reports. So the data set has been found to bias towards well-traveled roads because that's where most people pass by and identify the landslides. So these two reasons caused the differences between the distribution of the observed landslides and also our positive water balance status. But still, this general good agreement does not only apply to these two ARs, but also apply for the other 7 ARs. And we think that this gives us a positive information that the WBS might be useful for identify landslide susceptibility at a large scale. So that's our first question. We've answered that using the water balance analysis. And the second question is, what different hydrological processes are contributing to the landslides in California? To answer that, we apply a K-means clustering on both the landslide observations and on the positive water balance status grid cells. Continuing from this workflow here, we apply a K-means clustering and try to disentangle the potential contributions from various hydrometeorological processes, including intense precipitation, infiltration excess water, saturation excess water, snow melt, soil ice thawing, or rain on burn scar events. And for the K-means clustering, we input 4 features into it. So the 4 features are the precipitation intensity from the MR mass data set, and second is the WBS we developed from the water balance analysis. And the third is snow melt and soil ice thawing simulated by the model, the antecedent soil moisture simulated by the model. So aside from the first, the other 3 are model simulations. In these maps, the dots are the landslides and the colors are the corresponding values for the values for the corresponding parameters. As you can see that different landslides are clearly associated with different variables. So that indicate that these landslides might not be dominated by the same process. These 4 input features are selected based on expert knowledge, and also we conducted some statistical analysis to get rid of autocorrelation. And these variables are then standardized and normalized to be on the same scale from 0 to 1. And then we fit them into the K-means clustering to classify the 665 landslides and the 7,000 positive water balance status grid cells. In the clustering process, one important thing to determine is the numbers of clusters. To determine that, we rely on a quantitative metric called silhouette score. Silhouette score is the highest for 3 clusters. With a higher silhouette score, that means the clusters are better defined. They have a clear boundary. And the lower silhouette score means the clusters are poorly defined. We tested a series of numbers of clusters from 2 to 9 and found that 3 gives us the highest silhouette score. So we stick to that. In the next, I will show you what are the 3 distinct processes. So first, it's related to heavy precipitation. And this is the distribution for that cluster. The color shading here is the positive water balance status that fall in this cluster. And the black circles are the observed landslide events that fall in this cluster. And the second is related to pre-wetted soils before the ARs make landfall. This is the largest cluster. It consists of the most grid cells and most landslide observations. It's mostly along the northern to central California coast and also the foothills of Sierra. In the third cluster, snow melt and ice thawing is a dominant process. This is the one that distributed in high elevation mountains in California. So next, I will talk about the characteristics associated with each of them one by one. The first is the heavy precip cluster. To identify the characteristics, we plot out the PDFs for each of the clusters. And this one is the peak rain rate. The yellow one is for this cluster, is the heavy precip cluster. As you can see, it's associated with the highest mean peak rain rate among the 3 clusters. And on the right-hand side, I'm plotting the PDFs of infiltration excess water. This is basically just a difference between the maximum rain rate and the maximum infiltration rate. And as you can see, the yellow line is associated with the most positive infiltration excess among the 3 clusters. That means this cluster is dominated by heavy precipitation and infiltration excess generated runoff. In the second cluster, we found that moderate rain on pre-wetted soil is the dominant driver there. Again, this is the peak rain rate PDF. The red line here indicates it's only associated with moderate rainfall. However, before the rain hit the ground, the soil there has already been very close to saturation, and that's indicated by the red line here in the PDF of antecedent soil saturation. So the already saturated soil plus the moderate rain will put more burden on the ground and increase the landslide susceptibility there. The third cluster, snow melt and ice thaw, it's associated with high elevation, and also the blue line here indicates that this cluster is associated with substantially higher snow melt and soil ice fraction changes activities. So that's all of the 3 clusters, and some key takeaways from this project is that using a water balance analysis, we found that landslides preferably occur in areas where there is excess water availability. And second, because of the preferred occurrence in excess water, we think that water balance status that we developed may be useful for identifying landslide susceptibility at a regional scale. And lastly, using a K-means clustering, we identified 3 distinct hydrometeorological processes that are contributing to the increased landslide susceptibility in this compound weather event. And that's all of my 3 projects. And below, I will quickly recap and talk about some future directions. To sum up, in these 3 projects, we aim to develop a multi-scale, multi-factor, multi-process model by accounting for various of landslide triggering, landslide conditioning factors, including storm, postfire, and snowpack, ice, etc. And this is integrated into our hydrologic core that spans many orders of magnitudes of scales from points to regional. And this is our meteorology-informed hydrologic model. In the last project, we combined it with the landslide database to utilize regional landslide hydrology and combined with machine learning to improve our understanding or assessment for regional scale landslide susceptibility. The ultimate goal of developing this modeling framework is to provide assessments that at a scale that matches the scales of the meteorological events that trigger the landslides. And also, we have emphasized in many of these projects that account for the full range, the full spectrum of landslide conditioning factors at regional scales is pretty important to accurately resolve the cascading hazard chain. In the future, the susceptibility model we developed from these 3 projects can be expanded for many other applications. So we've shown that in the 3 projects, if drive the model with hindcast meteorology, then we are able to use it to guide post-event field observations or conduct hazard mapping after the fact. And if forced it with forecast meteorology, like what the National Water Model is doing, then we are able to use the simulations to inform early warning and conduct emergency response. And if forced it with downscale climate projections, we can look at even longer timescales that could help with climate adaptation, planning, and mitigation. But of course, there are more work needs to be done to develop the model. like coupling geotechnical components, etc. So yeah, more work to be done, and I'm really looking forward to what it would like in the future. That's all of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. I would like to acknowledge my co-author team and also the founding agency again, and also Cheyenne and Derecho, which are the NCAR's high performance computing clusters that I use to run my models. Thank you so much. Yeah.